Once again, this is the place for intellectual, spiritual, and biblical honesty. What that means, I'm not going to be certain about my terms, attempting to break. Still struggling, that is, in the completely honest. I'm not quite sure that I do not cognitive dissonance, confirmation bias that I would use in an argument, whether it be A, B, or C. But one of the things that I'm proud of is that we do have a chance to move forward together in a meaningful way, the kind of conversation that gives enough latitude, both left and right, to be inclusive of those who might engage, that is, in diversity. And so this morning we have two guests. One would be an atheist and one would be a theist, and both have strong positions. And what we're going to do this morning, we're simply going to place an atheist and a theist in juxtaposition. And what that means is sometimes we look way over to our right and we look at a wall and we say, oh, that wall is white. And then we look to our left and we see that that wall is also white. But sometimes we can't tell the difference between the two white walls unless we place them in contrast, that is, side by side. And so in order to sometimes see what another person is stating, that is, clearly, we need to place things side by side. We want to see these gentlemen talk and speak about what they think to be true, that is, side by side. And so this morning, it's going to be fun. It's going to be entertaining, possibly. But I think that both of these gentlemen represent a new day in which atheist and theist can come together without trying to kill each other. There was a day in Christianity where you might get your head cut off if you stated some things like AronRa might suggest, or even what Michael Hardin may put on the table. And so this morning we have a very well-spoken, one who articulates science in such a wonderful way, and that would be AronRa, and also a theologian by the name of Michael Hardin on the show this morning. And so I want to invite them to the conversation. Welcome, our AronRa. I'm doing well. I so enjoy having you on my shows simply because you're willing to say, hey, this is what I think to be true. You're not shy. You're capable of making your arguments. You're articulate, that is. And this morning, what I'd like to do, at the end of the day, that is, at the end of the program, I'd like for us to be the best of friends, because I think that this is how people move forward together. They learn that this is not a conflict. It's not, in this sense, it's not us versus them, but it's a mentality that says we can take this versus that and push back on it and have fun. What say you? Well, no, I'm saying that it is a conflict in this versus that, but it's not a conflict in us versus them. I'm trying to separate the two. Yeah. And so I welcome you to the show. I can't wait until you get to Pensacola, because one of the intentions that we have in having you here in Pensacola is filming not just your arguments, but your person, simply because you have made it known to me in various ways that you're a very compassionate person, and people need to see that side of you, how much you are fighting for humanity, for compassionism, and those things. And so thanks for being on the program.
Thank you, sir.
Michael Hardin, we had you on a few months ago. It was an honor as well to have you on. You're extremely articulate. You don't mind getting into the polemics, if you will, when it comes to discussing whether there is a God or discussing theology, etc. So welcome, Michael.
Thank you.
You're in Paris right now, correct?
I am in Paris, France, yes.
And so today, here you are. You're a theist. AronRa is an atheist. And what we want to do is we want to place what you guys think to be true in juxtaposition. I don't think that it's going to be difficult to say that both of you guys are not on the same page. That is, when it comes to what you think to be true. Would that be a fair assessment?
Well, I think we probably we probably visit the same barber, but I would say that's the extent of it.
The same barber. Okay. Well, this is going to be fun. And so I'm going to ask a question, and I would like for you guys to take it from there. I'm really concerned today, simply because I think that theists, in a sense, are dodging. And I'm a theist, and I have to say that many times when people ask me what it means for me to be a theist, it takes a long time for me to explain X, Y, and Z. I'm concerned that so many people are playing games, namely with the text. And Michael, you invited me to actually a conversation or something on Facebook with a translator. You were attempting to say, hey, listen, you're not using, translation modeling, that is in an honest way. And you really called that person out on it. And you really wanted people to say, if the text can be known in any sense of the word, at least play ball with the science of linguistic modeling. And I think that you did something very, very honest in that. And so I would like to put on the table, because I know that AronRa, sometimes he meets Christians, he meets different kinds of theists from all kinds of backgrounds, and they don't all say the same thing. And so this morning, I want you to get on the same page, that is, in contrasting something about your theology with what AronRa might push back on. In other words, tell me in brief, what is your theology?
I suppose my theology could be summed up in talking about Jesus, the true human. From my work that I don't think that Christianity takes the atheistic critique very seriously, and that I find particularly the work of Nietzsche very, very important in taking apart or deconstructing the concept of a power god, of who sits up in the heavens and is some divine puppeteer, or is in control of all things, or these kinds of things. A God who's completely able to affirm the creation or the human. So for me, as a theologian in the work that I'm doing, I'm going to anthropologically discuss Jesus or the concept of revelation, or even the term God. And I think that becomes very, very important. It's very, very different, I think, than the standard theist or the standard Christian theist who wants to begin from above. I prefer to begin from below.
Okay, we're having some difficulty with your audio. Were you able to hear everything that he stated, AronRa?
I got the gist of it. Yeah. He was talking about how Nietzsche and other atheist authors were important, but
you're blowing me out.
I'm still confused as to how Mr. Hardin, or in fact anybody, ever adopts that position. It's a mystery to me. The very concept of a belief that requires faith should invalidate itself on that one criteria.
I'm guessing. I'm guessing because I don't know you. We've never met. We've never talked. I've not read any of your work. Would you argue that science is completely empirical? That there's not a dimension of faith in scientific epistemology? Would you go that route, or how do you understand epistemology in relation to knowledge?
Okay, the summary answer: this is the symbol of the epistivist. And an epistivist is someone who rejects faith outright. We reject faith because it is the most dishonest position it is possible to hold. Faith is an unreasonable conviction asserted without reason and defended against all reason. And so if you start from a position of faith, I believe it would be impossible to make it less honest than it already is.
I've not heard of an epistivist before.
It's a new concept. The thing is, if you have atheists and you have a lot of them that are, I mean, you can be religious and be atheist at the same time. I mean, Buddhists, for example, shaman, animists,
Hmm.
and so on, Taoists. You can have people that have religious beliefs. They believe in their deceased ancestors and so forth. So an atheist doesn't necessarily mean that you're a skeptic, sadly, and it certainly doesn't mean that you're science-minded. And then you have anti-theists, and I'm an anti-theist as well, whereas we reject religion as a whole. But the real problem, the reason that religion is a problem, is that it's based on faith, and the root of all of the evil of that is the concept of faith. So that's the route that I would have to attack. And in answer to your question, no, science contains no faith.
So I'm guessing that the work of epistemologists like Michael Polanyi don't factor into your understanding of the relationship between the observer and the observed in, say, physics.
I don't know the name of the person you just mentioned. I don't know who that is, but we might be trying to talk past each other here because when I view faith, and
Yeah, and that's
I've had to research this a
yeah.
number of ways to make sure that the application is being used the way that I'm using it, or that I'm using it correctly. I've had to gauge it through all the references in the Bible, for example, and also in the Bhagavad Gita, and in sermons, and from apostate preachers and current preachers and so forth, just to make and hymns and sermons and so on, to make sure that the way that the word faith is used is the way that I'm using it. And I mean, it's also supported by the dictionary, but it doesn't matter what the dictionary says if the dictionary doesn't match what the theologian or the theologians say. So I had to make sure that I'm on par with that. In science, everything is going to be empirical, rational. You have to have a prerequisite of evidence before you can make any assertion. You can't even say that something is possible unless you have evidence to indicate that possibility. Otherwise, there are things that are not possible. And in cases where something that we can't explain has evidently happened, when all the evidence points to something happening that we can't explain, we have to concede that that happened, and then we got to figure out why or how. But
Yeah,
at no point do we ever have a firm conviction that is not based on evidence, and that's what faith is.
yeah, I guess I'm not using faith in your definition. I wouldn't understand faith that way at all.
Okay, well
That would
then,
not be my definition. Yeah, let me give you a quick example of Polanyi, he says that when a physicist goes to deal on a quantum level, creates an experiment, say to examine photon interaction, the very device that's used to measure the photons in the results, as you know, interferes with the very process of the knowledge being gained. You're familiar with the
yes.
experiments, two slits and these things? And so the analogy he uses is that of a blind man with a cane. When the blind man holds the cane in his hand and he's touching the ground, he does not feel his hand touching the cane. It's as though his hand extends all the way to the ground through the instrument, and that's what he's feeling with. And Polanyi refers to that as the tacit dimension. For me, that's what faith is. If faith is that tacit dimension. It's that reaching out with an instrument, but one is not somehow divorced from that which one is observing. In other words, there is an interaction between the observer and the observed, which is why, for me, the standard atheistic critique of theism holds true. I'm absolutely convinced of it. I don't find very much in what would be standard Western kind of apologetics or standard Western reasoning around theism to hold very much water at all. And so this is where this conversation could be very, very fascinating because, like you said just a few moments ago, we don't want to talk past each other. So the first thing I want to say is I don't accept the definition of faith you're working with. I have a whole different understanding. And it may well be that there's perhaps a little more common ground between the way we're looking at things than might appear to the eye. Just maybe.
All right. I doubt that. From my experience, although I can show that I'm using the word faith the way that I said, the way the Bible uses it, the way theologians past and present have used it, there's always a redefinition required. I mean, every time I talk to a theist, they always tell me, no, that's not what faith means. And then they give me a completely different definition, becomes evidence-based. But but then they're never able to present evidence that would justify the conclusions that they've drawn. And when you further investigate the reasons why they've drawn the conclusions that they've drawn, it turns out that they're using the same definition of faith that I am. They're just not calling it that.
Yeah, I don't know. I'll be honest with you, I don't do much work in logical positivism and the kind of empirical thinking that you engage in. For me, that's fairly passé and went out about 50 years ago. So I don't follow that line of thinking at all.
Okay.
If I can jump in, I would like to posit possibly something that would be meaningful. For instance, I do agree that so many people today, that is in the modern age, are using this English term however they want to. I agree with that, and I agree that lexical theorists have simply taken the most popular usage and put it at the number one category. However, when one looks back into history and looks at, for instance, Romans chapter 1, verse 17, and I can read this from the Greek text. It states, "Ekpisteos eis pistin." And the Apostle Paul, if he is actually the writer of this text, and if the reconstruction models are correct, that is by lexical theorists who have been reconstructing this by dealing with all of the syntagmatic and paradigmatic analysis that provide actually what we would call the usage, namely of Paul, and so we would be dealing more with a synchronic issue, they would say that this is coming from perspective to perspective. And so the idea that we're speaking about concerning usage is very important in this discussion, in that the modern person may say X, but it's true that, Paul was not attempting to spin, the typical Western mindset, namely of faith, if that makes sense.
Regardless, I think for me, it's always going to come down to a scientific analysis. It's always going to come down to whether we were talking about matters of fact in a courtroom.
But isn't that a scientific analysis? That is taking a syntagmatic and paradigmatic analysis, namely of the text, and building upon scientific modeling. Now, these are not guessing games of theologians. For instance, Dr. Ann Nyland is a lexical theorist, and she's really not into theology at all, and she completely agrees with this particular portion of the text that all of the science really suggests that this is coming from one perspective to another. In other words, it shows people in transition, that is, in their thinking.
Okay. What I was talking about with regard to faith previously, I'll just give a couple of examples so that Mr. Hardin and the audience will understand where I'm coming from. I have many times heard believers tell me that these may be what the facts are, but I prefer to believe this. Or, and I was in a movie with, I can't remember his name, but this guy made a movie where he was interviewing atheists at a convention, and he's a Christian apologist, so that he, at the end of this, where he interviews all of us, he can then say that we didn't change his mind, and that's his declaration of victory. But he also described himself in one of his own sermons at his own church. I got a video of that where he said that he described his own position, saying that I have evidence that A exists, but I choose to believe B. Although everything points to A, I'm going with B. And then we have so many of the recent films for apologetics, like Questioning Darwin, where one of the people on the panel said that any scientific fact that contradicts the Bible must be wrong, because the Bible must always be true, no matter what, even when you can prove that it's not. And to back up that statement, another person on that same show said that if the Bible said that 2 plus 2 equals 5, he would not question that. He would find some way to believe it. So it doesn't matter if you can prove the Bible wrong, they will simply never accept it. And of course, that's not the only person that's like that. William Jennings Bryan, a presidential candidate once upon a time, prosecuting attorney at the Scopes monkey trial, said that if the Bible said that Jonah swallowed the whale, he would believe it, because believing one miracle is just as easy as believing another. And in all of these cases, they are believing impossible absurdities for no reason, and they are announcing that they will not accept any reason against them. As a matter of fact, all the creationist organizations, every one of them that exists, posts a statement of faith as if this were something to be proud of, wherein they announce in advance that they have already rejected all the evidence that may ever be discovered should it contradict their interpretations of Bronze Age folklore. So
Yes, and
that's what...
Yeah, and I would agree with you. These people are fools. They're absolute absurd fools.
I agree.
Absolutely, I'd agree with you. But that's what you're dealing with there is simply Christian fundamentalism, and
Okay.
and the in the larger academic community, like if I, and I hate to use the word intelligentsia, but at least amongst thinking people. So, for example, I accept the theory of evolution. I'm not a creationist. I accept that we live in a multiverse. I mean, when it comes to science, I don't have a problem with what the scientists discover. I work with that. That's the paradigm I work with in my books and my website and everything I do. I agree with you that the fundamentalists, or even what we might refer to as those that are bound to some kind of apologetic tradition that's grounded in Plato and Aristotle, that feels the need to somehow articulate a position that is absurd. I agree with you that has got to be deconstructed, and that is the bane right now. It is the bane of Western Christianity. And you and I both can see not just the epistemological issues, but we can also see the sociological implications, the political implications, the economic implications of this absurd kind of thinking. So in my work, I am out there deconstructing this also, this very same thing. I mean, I despise the Ken Hams and the TV preachers and I mean, to me, if the Bible said 2 plus 2 equals 5, I would say that's wrong, because mathematics is pure language. 2 plus 2 will always equal 4, at least in this universe.
Well, thank you for that. It's a wonderful thing to hear a Christian get upset over these type of people, because you understand that these type of people run most of the governments in the southern states of this country.
That's true. That's true.
Oh, man.
And it's very disturbing.
I'm with you. 100%. I'm with you.
And I wish that I could get what I consider to be... I wish I could get what I consider the mainstream Christians, the vast majority of people who never question their belief, never read the Bible, don't really, they're Christian because they were born that way and because they think the word good attaches to Christian. So if they identify as good, that means they're Christian, and they don't know anything more about it. I have people in my own family for which the entire theological argument is, well, I'm a Christian. And then I know the conversation's over right there, because that's all they know. They've never cracked open that book. They have no idea what's in it, and they would be horrified if I were to show them. But right. I can't get these people to read a chick tract or to watch the Trinity Broadcast Network. I can't get them to pay attention to what any of the leaders on the radical fringe are directing them. I mean, they'll offer their votes, they'll offer their donations, and they don't realize that they're being, or the way that they're being misled. And they certainly don't, when we talk about Christian fundamentalists, they don't realize the damage that they're doing to their own theology. And I would
Oh,
wish that
oh,
the
yeah.
mainstream Christians would be so much more useful to myself, and I think for everyone involved, if they would realize how damaging the fundamentalists are.
Yes.
Because it's a form of religious extremism, and every form of religious extremism that I'm aware of is detrimental.
Excellent
Well,
teaching.
Ron, just know that there are people out there like me that are just we are in the trenches battling these people every single day. This is what I do for a living. I battle these people from their own pulpits. I mean, I do it gently when I'm there, but I'm constantly seeking to deconstruct them. You said something earlier about the preacher that said, if the facts disagreed with him, reminded me of the great philosopher Hegel. So this kind of logic is not limited to just preachers, because Hegel was approached and said that someone said to him, the facts disagree with you. And Hegel's response was, so much worse for the facts. I mean,
Yeah.
you don't have to be a Southern Baptist to take that line of thinking, So
Yeah, and on
here's
that,
the thing.
yes, go ahead.
Well, here's the thing. You are articulating a legitimate critique of what I call Gnosticism Christianity. The reality is the fundamentalist, the conservative evangelical, I would venture to say even the progressive in American Christianity, American Christianity is fundamentally Gnostic, and that's the real problem with it. And by Gnostic, I mean these people literally believe that they're saved by believing the right things. And that's the biggest problem in Christianity in America. And I think because we've sowed this kind of thinking globally for 200 years, we're not just sowing bad theology, we're sowing bad politics, we're sowing bad economics, we're sowing bad sociology. This model is got to go. It is dying. It is dying. I mean, I can point to hundreds of authors in the academy, and by the academy I mean the American Academy of Religion or the Society of Biblical Literature, that are just coming down on this kind of thinking. Our problem right now is the work that someone like myself does is not popular. I don't exactly have the money rolling in. Not that I want it,
Yeah,
because I really don't give a shit. Oh,
yeah.
sorry. I didn't mean, I don't know if I can say that
Oh,
online.
shit's fine here. I mean,
Okay.
shit's fine. It rolls.
But when you're out there critiquing this dominant model, you're challenging an empire. And sometimes you really do, pardon the usage here, but you really do feel like David going up against Goliath.
Well, to give you an idea, and I know that France, where you are now, used to be this way, and from everything I know of it's not this way now. But here in Dallas, for example, the Dallas half of the DFW Metroplex, we have 80 to 90 mega churches.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Now, if a mega church
down in Dallas.
Yeah, so if a mega church is, I can't remember what it's thousands of members. I think it's multiple thousands of regular members, and sanctuaries in excess of 4,500 seats and things of this nature. And all of these churches bring in, hundreds of millions of dollars a year. When you think about 80 or 90 mega churches in one metroplex, or one half in this case of the metroplex, think about the amount of money that's going through that, and then just look at all of the other mega churches. I mean, I think we counted 11. I was going over to a friend's house from my house, and we counted 11 mega churches between my house and hers. It's devastating. And this is where all of the political power comes from. This is where all the legislation comes from. These people all vote in a block.
Yes.
I mean, the churches have tax exempt status for the reason that they will not manipulate the vote. But of course, that's exactly what they do anyway, because they get to do whatever they want to do, and they're completely unaccountable.
Yep.
Now, while I would, I suppose you and I have to have some point of context in this whole thing. And while I would love to have an ally that lights up other Christians to realize what's going on, I'm supposing I'm going to have to contest you on some point. But before I do, I just want to bring up one other thing. I had the joy of encountering a room full of Christians and pointing out to them that they were talking well about Pat Robertson, thinking what a great and caring leader he was. And I had to point out how he had said on national TV in 1994, I think it was, he told his 30,000 some odd followers to go out and kill homosexuals where you find them, because if you kill homosexuals, or the reason that we have earthquakes in this country is because he said, the United States was the only country on earth that allowed homosexuals to live. So, you know, you have to take these
even the Jesus I know pukes at that kind of stuff.
Okay, so I'm curious about the Jesus you know, and compare that to the Jesus they know.
The Jesus they know, I call the Antichrist. Their Jesus is a warrior. The Jesus of the Gospels is a peacemaker. Their Jesus is an angry, vitriolic, nasty, hateful, xenophobic Messiah. The Jesus of the Gospels is an extraordinary example of what humanity looks like when humanity cares, nurtures, heals, restores relationships, and offers a vision of what human life apart from violent retribution looks like.
Okay, that's a very interesting interpretation, and I'm curious how you got that out of Scripture.
Oh, well, I do a lot of exegesis. I do a lot of work in church history. I do a lot of work in theology. I've written books and books on this. The fundamentalist or the conservative evangelical Jesus, the Jesus of the Middle Ages, the Jesus of Western Christendom is a foe, a fugazi. If we were in the New York Diamond District, we'd say he's a fugazi. He's false. What they've done is they've projected themselves into the Gospels and then read themselves out of the Gospels and called it Jesus.
Well, it is interesting, the people that I talk to, how they manage to read between the lines without actually reading the lines.
Mm-hmm.
So that much of American theology is not anywhere based in Scripture, and it's so easy to expose. Where does the Bible imply that the serpent in the garden was supposed to be anything but a snake? Well, where does the first book say that? In the last book. That's where, in Revelations 9. But of course that's not what it says, is it? Well, it says that old serpent. So interpreting that must be talking about that first serpent.
Genesis, as though snakes ever had vocal cords. I mean, Genesis 1 through 11 is mythology. It's the same thing you're going to find in the Enuma Elish. It's the same thing you're going to find in Aztec mythology. It's mythology.
Thank you for that. I had a marvelous argument with somebody, with a graduate of Liberty University.
Liberty.
Well, you want to talk scholarship. And I asked this guy...
There are... Go ahead, I'm sorry.
I asked this guy, can snakes talk? And his answer is, well, if you believe in a God that can do anything, then you can believe that snakes talk. Which means he doesn't believe that snakes talk. He just believes what he's told to believe. It's a matter of pretend. If I had a spaceship, or a TARDIS, for example, if I had a time machine and I would invite one of these people into it, I have the strangest feeling that if I were to set this for 25,000 years ago, or any time prior to 10,000 years ago, I would think that the person would refuse to go in for two reasons. One, he doesn't want to know what the truth really is. And two, he already does know what the truth really is.
Well,
he just doesn't want to admit it.
Reason.
Go ahead.
Yeah, but there's a third reason. They believe humans and dinosaurs coexisted. They would be afraid of the dinosaurs.
I don't earnestly think that these people believe that. I mean, I realize that there are people who are whose stupidity is so extreme that it questions their sanity. I mean, I've actually talked to a number of geocentrists. I don't know how it is that it's possible for somebody to ignore that much reality or to delude themselves as far as they do. You wouldn't believe the level of it. I don't want to say ignorance. It's I don't even know what to describe it. I mean, I got into an argument with one guy.
You need to come on my Facebook page. I deal with that level of ignorance every day.
The guy that believes that the Earth is not a sphere but a bowl, and we live on the inside of the bowl, and that space is really tiny. Yeah, yeah. I encounter people like this all the time.
Look, I'm not there.
Okay.
And I'm not there, and I know tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and millions of Christians that are not at that place. Mm-hmm. Our problem is, I mean, if it's a problem, is that the paradigm shift toward a rational worldview that is also theistic. We are in the midst of an extraordinary paradigm shift in Christendom. And so the kinks haven't been worked out, the bugs haven't been worked out, but what we've at least been able to do is to say, we're not going to allow somebody just to pull the wool over our eyes with God said it, I believe it, that settles it. That just doesn't wash anymore. That doesn't work anymore. And that's why in the work that I do, I've derived the most benefit from the work of an anthropologist known as René Girard. In fact, it's the Girard apartment here in Paris that I'm staying. And what Girard has been able to do is articulate a theory in the evolutionary process. You said, if I wrote this right, religion is a problem because of faith. Girard is able to articulate a theory that religion is a problem because of violence, that religion originates in human violence. In violence done to scapegoats, violence done to random victims. And thus the sacrificial process becomes the heart and soul of religion, all religion. And so Girard proposed in 1972 what has been hailed as the first atheistic theory of religion in his book, Violence and the Sacred. For me, that's the starting place that Christianity, if it's going to have anything to say to the 21st century and beyond, has to start with. We have to start without presupposing transcendence. We have to start with an atheistic theory of religion. And that's what I'm trying to do in my work as a Christian theologian. It may seem a bit oxymoronic. I understand that. But at least there are those of us that are seeking to do this kind of work.
Okay, before we get into where you and I can test each other, one of the things that I see statistically, which I find bothersome, is that I'm not seeing an indication of what you're talking about this paradigm shift. I'm seeing two statements that are alarming when seen together. On the one hand, we have that statistically religion is dying, all religions everywhere, but particularly Christianity in the United States is in a state of decline, just generally speaking. We have atheism on the rise simultaneously. But then we have another statistic in that creationism is also on the rise.
Yes.
So if we have less Christians in this country than we did, but we have more creationists than we did, and we have more atheists than we did, then what that tells me is we have a population that is losing the middle ground. We're losing, where it used to be that the average guy would have some understanding that you have to accept science on some level because it just makes sense and it helps you understand the way things really are. But people would also have some concept of faith and a soul and all of this. And that's the middle of the road. That was the average person. And now it's polarized so that people are either rejecting faith entirely or they're rejecting science entirely.
Yes.
And when you have a polarized population, you've got a dangerous population.
Absolutely. I'm in agreement with you. And this is the problem right now that we're experiencing. It's what Girard would call a mimetic conflict. where the extremes have become doubles of one another. They're mirrors of each other. And really what's happening, from my perspective, what's happening is they're arguing for the rights to the presuppositions. The atheists and the fundamentalists are arguing for the rights to say, we can be certain of. And I don't live in a universe where certainty exists.
Nor do I. And
Excellent.
speaking for atheists in general, if I may, I don't know one that embraces or tolerates presuppositions. I know atheists that believe ridiculous things. I know atheists that believe in homeopathy. I know atheists that will actually believe that there are reptiles from the Sirius star system, inhuman guys running our government. Just because you don't believe in God doesn't mean you don't believe in anything, Loopy. But trying to associate with science-minded people, presuppositions are generally excluded and discarded from the philosophies of the people that I associate with.
I'm sorry that those are the kinds of Christians that you know. I wish you could hang around the folks that I hang around with. I think you'd have
Well,
a
you're
great
in
time.
France. I'm in Texas.
Well, come on over, bro. Well, I'm only here for 3 days, and then I go to England.
In other words, Michael, he's trying to say that you're in hell. I mean, that he's in hell. I mean, Texas.
Football fan. Anybody that lives that close to Jerry World, that's hell.
I can understand it, and I really sympathize for AronRa, that is in the fight that he is in there in Texas, because I mean, you can't even be a politician and say, "Hey, I'm an atheist, vote for me." It's
actually
difficult.
illegal here. It's against the Constitution. We're just waiting for somebody to try to challenge it, but anybody that wants to actually win an election is not going to announce that they're atheists. They're all going to declare their Christianity, because it's a card you have to play in order to do the game. Mm-hmm. So, getting to the contest between us.
All right.
Why do you believe, first, I'm curious, one, why you believe in a God at all, and two, why you would believe in the Christian God versus any other concept of God like Krishna, for example?
I got to write those two questions down, why a God and then why the Christian God, so I don't forget them. The reason that I believe in God, when Carl Jung was once asked if he believed in God, he said, I don't need to believe, I know. That may not work for you, but for me, there's a certain truth in this. It may well be that God doesn't exist. You may well be right. You may well be right. I could live my whole life believing in God, and at the end, there's no God. I don't find out because there's no God, but there just is no God. On the other hand, the meta-narrative that I choose to give meaning to my life has a God. That's how I choose to have the meta-narrative for my life. The reason I choose that meta-narrative is because there are, I don't know how to explain this. I'm really going to get, don't take me over your lap and spank me now when I say this. But for the last 12 years...
you already know it's coming, right?
Yeah. For the last 12 years, my wife and I have been involved in Native American shamanism and learning an awful lot of things. So when I go out into the woods, at the forest, my experience is not of God, but there is a transcendence. It may well be I'm projecting it. I'm willing to own that. But I'm also humble enough out there to at least say thank you to Gaia, to the earth. And if that language that I use is thank you, God, thank you to the Creator, to the great mystery, that's language that works for me. And it may well be because I was raised in it. It may well be because that's all I've ever known. Now, why the Christian God? There's two reasons. One is that I don't view God as violent or retributive. The gods, the ancient gods, the archaic gods, the gods of myth, and the gods of religion tend to be retributive or violent. For me, Jesus, as the human figure in touch with God, reveals God to be non-violent, non-retributive. That's the God that I believe in. So I don't believe in the Christian God. The Christian God is a God that's two-faced, or in my books I call him Janus-faced. The Christian God is an ugly God. The Christian God is a God that when you pray, you hope he ain't been drinking. The Christian God is problematic. I don't believe in the Christian God. I do believe in the Creator that the Jewish Jesus believed in. The beneficent, nurturing, loving, caring Creator. The Creator who gives, who gives the... And I don't mean in a deus ex machina way. I mean that when I walk out into the woods, there are blueberries there to eat. There's shelter I can create from the forest debris. There is life to be found in the earth. It's beneficent. It gives of itself. That, for me, is resonant with the character of God as I know God. So I don't believe in the Christian God. I have a real problem with the Christian God. I have a problem with all gods. Gods are violent. Gods are power mongers. Gods are egocentric. Gods are domineering. Gods are puppeteering. To me, that's what Jesus came to deconstruct. I mean, for me, the greatest atheistic statement in the history of humanity is uttered on the cross when Jesus quotes the 22nd Psalm, my God, why have you abandoned me? He's not arguing there for some penal substitution theory of the atonement where the Father's pouring out his wrath or some silly nonsense like that. What he's doing is he's quoting a text about scapegoating. The whole psalm is about scapegoating and being a random victim around which the community seeks to rebuild itself. And the citation of that psalm is really Jesus' way of critiquing all gods. There is no God who's going to come to rescue the day. That God doesn't exist.
Okay. It's always a two-level argument when I talk to atheists, because they want, usually, and I'm not throwing you in this generalization, usually they want to argue some deistic concept of God, saying that you can't prove that such a God doesn't exist. And okay, logically that's correct, but I can prove that the Bible God doesn't exist. And of course,
I'm going to tell you the Bible God doesn't exist.
I agree with you, but you say you're talking about Jesus, and Jesus is depicted in only one book, and it's the Bible. And as an anthropomorphic immortal with magic powers, I would have to say that Jesus qualifies as a deity. He's clearly not
a shaman. I mean, Jesus is not the only healer in his day. In Jesus' own time, there was Honi the circle drawer. There was Onias. There were other Jewish healers and exorcists in his time. He wasn't the only one running around doing these things, of whom stories are told.
Right, and then we got other things where other people are pretending to speak for Jesus at different parts of the Bible.
No doubt. No doubt the Gospels themselves contain editorial additions by the church, which is why
some of these, like the one where it's supposed to be Jesus crushing non-believers in his bloody winepress.
Oh, the book of the Revelation, does that even belong in the canon? I mean, look, for the first 5 centuries, that was the most contentiously debated book. For the first 10 centuries, it wasn't accepted universally into the canon. The Eastern Orthodox Church has never, ever, in 2,000 years, used it in its liturgy. Luther threw it out of the canon. at the time of the Reformation. Zwingli threw it out of the canon at the time of the Reformation. Calvin wrote a commentary on every book of the Bible but Revelation. Does it belong there? I mean, these are questions that need to be raised. And if it does belong there, why are we making the weirdest book of the Bible the center of our theological thinking?
From a linguistic standpoint, and this is the consensus among people who deal with the language flux of what's called Koine Greek, this particular book, that is the book of what we call Revelation, isn't a sensible book in this sense. It's not written.
That's what happens when you take bad acid.
Exactly. It appears to be written by someone who didn't understand Koine. It's just all over the place. And so, Michael is right. The editorial editions, namely of how this thing has been fixed up over the years, is the only reason that we even have it in a book. But that's a secondary point. I think that this is a wonderful, wonderful show to demonstrate that atheists and theists can come together and we can place our thoughts in juxtaposition. And yet at the same time, I think right now we're starting to see there is a lot of agreement. We're just human beings struggling with thoughts and processes. And so I speak for a lot of people here. This conversation needs to continue. So go for it.
Okay, well, let me just throw one other thing out there. We were talking earlier about faith, and I mentioned that the way that I define faith is when you believe, you have a firm conviction. This is the way the dictionary describes it too. It is a firm conviction, stoic, that is not based on evidence. And evidence is what I would define, is what the only thing I can define as the reason to believe something, is when you have facts that ally with that position. So when I asked your reason for why you believe there's a God at all, you said that you parallel the philosophy that you don't believe you know, which is a firm conviction. Now, I would argue that it's not actually knowledge if it's not demonstrable, but it's still a firm conviction. And what was the reason behind it? You didn't give any. It was, you just believe it because you believe it, and so there wasn't any evidence behind it. So I mentioned to you earlier in the conversation that in all cases, when arguing with theists, they always want to redefine what faith is, and then when you ask them the reasons why they believe, it always comes down to faith. They believe because they believe, and that's the best reason they can give.
Well, I think you're always going to find that's going to be inevitable, and that is the nature of faith. I mean, for me, the word pistis in Greek, faith, is best rendered by the English term trust. I mean, if there's, I think, for example, a child in the best situation learns to trust their parent. They don't have reasons at an early age, but they trust that mommy will feed them dinner. They trust that daddy won't beat the shit out of them when he puts them to bed at night. They develop, in a healthy parenting or family situation, they develop trust. They cannot articulate the rationale for the trust. In the same way, I think, for me, that's how faith functions. The older I get, the more life makes sense to me in the meta-narrative that includes the father of Jesus, the Abba, the daddy, the papa. But I can certainly understand, and this is where I think it's important, I can certainly understand why people have thrown out the God of Western Christendom, critique the God of Western Christendom, don't want anything to do with that dysfunctional, mentally disturbed God. I absolutely understand that. I mean, I do.
I'm glad you described it the exact same way that I would. You know, people often say that I hate God, and while I want to argue that it's impossible to hate someone that doesn't exist, I do have to concede that I also hated the wicked stepmother in Cinderella. What an awful bitch that was. And so I hate God in the same sense that I hate Cinderella's wicked stepmom.
Right.
It still doesn't give me a reason why someone would believe in a God.
I can't give you a reason. I can't give you, well, I mean, I could tell you the reasons that work for me, and you could pick them all apart. But that wouldn't destroy my trust.
And when you talk about trust, you can base your trust. You can base your trust on evidence, or you can base your trust on faith. You can't just define trust as faith. It doesn't work that way.
Again, I want to come back to the analogy of a little child. A child trusts. What's the look in Erickson's higher development of the first thing that children learn is trust. That's the first basic psychological building block is trust.
Being completely dependent, you don't have a choice in that.
And I think that.
But some kids figure out early on that mom's not going to feed them, and that daddy is going to beat the crap out of them. So you can trust in the situation. You can tell when you come home and daddy's drunk that you better get out of the house. And so they develop what we know as trust issues. Well, we're also talking about based on evidence now, and not based on faith.
But they still develop trust issues. And I think that's where a lot of people are at. I mean, do you want me to prove to you empirically that God exists? I can't do that. If I tell you, I had a near-death experience, that's not going to mean anything to you, because you could cite all the arguments about the human brain and the way the neural systems work at the time of death. And there's no evidence.
Right, and also that other people that experience that, if they come from a different religious background, they of course will experience whatever religious background they have been culturally assigned.
Yeah, so that's right.
So I don't have a reason to believe, and I find that not having a reason to believe something equals having at least one good reason not to believe it.
And that's fine. But the position of Christian theology for 2,000 years has never been intelligo ut credam. I understand in order to believe. The Christian position has always been credo ut intelligam. I believe, therefore I seek understanding. That's always been the way it works. So this kind of a debate is never going to convince you or me to flip sides or to move different directions or anything else. And the bottom line for me is, and you've alluded to this already, from my perspective, let me back this up. If I'm perceiving your perspective correctly, you look at me and say he has no rational basis for saying what he says. From my perspective, you're still stuck in logical positivism of the Vienna School in the 1920s. I look at science, I read modern science, I read modern epistemology, and I go, my God, we've moved so far beyond that position, it would never work in modern science. It only works in the laboratory, but not in the theory.
You haven't given me any reason to believe that my philosophical perspective is failing in any application of science.
Well, for example, do scientists, when they form a hypothesis, when they form a hypothesis, they have a certain amount of evidence. They don't have all the evidence, but they have enough evidence to say, okay, I'm going to formulate a hypothesis that's going to help me create or design experiments to augment the evidence that I already have. Is that the correct way of looking at it from your perspective?
Yeah, you're gonna come up with you're gonna think hypothetically. You're gonna say, if this is true, then these other factors should also be true. And even if I can't test that one thing directly, I can test these other things peripherally. And then if this works out, then maybe that supports the original idea I had. And if there's some surprise in there, then this is something that I got wrong. And the only way that you can improve understanding is by finding the flaws in your current perspective and correcting them.
Okay, now, at some point in that process, as the scientist is saying, I have this evidence, I think it looks like this is the model, but I have to be able to design experiments. At that point, are they not engaging in faith? And by faith, what I
No.
mean is that, well, just a sec, let me see if I can work this out. I've never had this kind of a conversation before, so I've not had to do this kind of thinking out loud before. Do they not have to create the what's the word I'm looking for? Tools. Do they have to design tools to seek to verify what they think is out there? So in other words, if I'm looking up at the sky through a telescope and I'm hypothesizing that the planets are elliptical in orbit, and the math works. I mean, the math works on the chalkboard, and I'm looking out here. If I want to be able to demonstrate it empirically, I have to be able to design a tool that will help me prove that, correct?
Yeah, the experiment isn't necessarily designing a tool. And you can create a hypothetical situation where you propose a possible answer and then you're going to test for that answer. But you can also use the experiments without any clue of what you're starting with. When Galileo was testing whether balls of different sizes and weight fall at the same speed and that they accelerate when rolling downhill, he was checking out, how these things fall. But the idea of why they fall had not yet been postulated. So I mean, then you get Newton, who's looking at these experiments, and he comes up with this idea of gravitation. He's the one with the hypothesis, and he's basing it on experiments that were done completely blind, with no hypothesis attached to it. He's just doing the experiments.
And so Newton formulates a theory.
Yep.
And his theory has an absolute geometry. 300, 400 years later, Einstein comes along and says, that absolute geometry doesn't work. We have to be able to talk about relativity in relation to time and space. Absolutes don't work. So Newton's theory, while correct for the time, was incorrect in terms of reality. That is, it's continually being modified. In other words, science is not truth. Science
Science is not. I want to clarify something. The way
Sure.
that I use truth may not be the way that other people do. I have to be very specific in my definitions. And truth is something that I find that is very often defined as many different things. So for truth, to me, reality is not truth. Statements about reality can be truth. But when we put a witness on the stand and we have him swear to tell the truth, we do not assume that everything that he says after that point is the truth simply because he swore it would be. It then becomes the job of the court to determine whether it is the truth. So with this in mind, I have to define truth as whatever statements about reality can be verified to be true. If you can verify that it is true, then it is truth. If you can't show that it is true, well, then we don't know if it's truth or not.
I'm with you there.
And to Newton's credit, you were talking about absolutes. Newton did say that he has this inverse square law, and that so far as he can see, it seems to measure out pretty well. So yes. I wasn't reading an absolute into that statement.
No, I know you weren't, but what I was trying to show is that the model shifts.
Okay.
Our scientific understanding is a model. It's not reality. The map is not territory. I think the same is true in theology. The map is not the territory. I would venture to say 99.9% of the Christians you've met, the map is the territory. That's the problem.
Yeah, now there's a small subset of Hindu that also believe the same way, that they don't distinguish doctrine from deity.
Mm-hmm.
When they're talking about this deistic kind of a God that I can't logically disprove, I can't prove the negative, that's not the thing that they're arguing for. The thing that they're arguing for is the Bible, because if you disprove the Bible, those people would be atheists in a moment.
Right.
Because they're not worshiping a God, they're worshiping a book.
A text, that's right. And that for me is still the major problem of the three monotheistic religions. When you worship a book, see again, I'm going to come back to Girard's theory on violence and religion. When you worship a text, when a text is the foundation or the basis for faith, you're inevitably going to use the text to continue to justify the very paradigm out of which you were born, which is always involves the justification of violence. That's the problematic of the entire three major world religions that are grounded in a text. Now, and I'm not a Hindu scholar. I don't study it. I don't know it. So, and you've certainly read a lot more than I have. Do you need to get some water? You okay?
No, I'm fine.
Okay.
No, go ahead.
Well, as I understand it, in the Hindu tradition, you still find the same kinds of important moves that you find in the Judeo-Christian tradition, which are essentially they're anti-sacrificial moves. They're shifts away from the use of blood or the use of sacrifice to appease the deities. You find that in that tradition. You find it in the ancient Greek playwrights, Sophocles, Aristophanes. In other words, what I would call revelation is not limited to the Bible. It's not even limited to religion.
Well, then you and Cy 10 could have an amusing conversation. You know what a master theologian he is. He said that revelation is entirely limited to the Bible, that it's not possible to have revelation outside of the Bible. So however you interpret those words is all you've got. And not even God himself in person could ever contest that.
I don't buy it. I don't buy it.
Okay, so again, you said you don't worship the Christian God. You have a very different interpretation. With all due respect to your scholarship, my interpretation of the Jesus that I find in the Gospels is very different from yours. What I read is a faith healer, not very different from the charlatans we have today. I have somebody who believes that whether you believe it matters more than whether it is true, and that if you believe hard enough, that you can change reality. Or if you can't change reality, if you can at least convince yourself that you can, then that's just as good. It's all a great deal of pretend, and the only value that I can ascribe to any statement is how much of it we can show to be true, or how accurate that statement can be shown to be. And so if you can't show that there's any accuracy to it at all, the statement is then rendered useless and empty.
I'm not going to disagree with you. Most religion, I need to be very careful because I'm sure I've got a fair number of Facebook followers watching this podcast, but here's the thing. Freud was right. Religion is infantile. I'm right there. I'm not talking about a naive approach to this topic. I am talking about an approach to this topic that involves a tremendous amount, and I'm going to use this term, I don't even know if I'm making it up, but it involves a tremendous amount of intellectual suffering, the same kind of intellectual suffering that an anthropologist goes through in forming a hypothesis, a philosopher goes through in wrestling through terms, a physicist goes through trying to figure out where the math on the board is wrong. The kind of faith you're referring to, the kind of Christianity you're talking about, for me is infantile. It's a dead end. It's useless. It only produces bad politics, bad sociology, and bad economics. I don't see Jesus as a charismatic faith healer like the people of today. In fact, I've already pissed off a whole bunch of charismatics on my Facebook page by pointing out that their view of healing is so opposite of Jesus, because when Jesus healed people, he re-socialized them. In other words, his healings were not about, "Whoo, look at me, I'm the Son of God, I'm so powerful, whack, whack, whack." No, he healed people so that they could re-enter human community. And I don't see that today. All I see is a bunch of people getting up, showing they got the Holy Ghost, hallelujah, and they have all their anecdotal stories of this and that and the other. Has nothing to do with re-socialization. And so for me, if there's not a deeply profound anthropological element, then it's bullshit.
Okay, then why are you and I not on the same side of this argument?
I would say that there's a whole nother level of scholarship of the Gospels, a whole nother level of scholarship and ways of reading Jesus that might very well interest you and might give you an appreciation for the historical figure of Jesus that is not this crap Jesus that's out there in Christianity.
Well, I would also argue that regardless what it is, that it would never become a historical Jesus. I don't see that. Now, in the stories of Jesus, I do find elements that sound like, that this could only have happened to a natural person. Like, it's not possible that this person with this omniscient being wouldn't know when figs were in season, and so he would get pissed off at a tree and curse it. This isn't going to happen. Likewise, it sounds to me like the typical faith healer when he charges his own people with this faith healing ability and tells them to go out and do the same thing. It's just like when Kevin Copeland, the evangelical here in Dallas, marries a woman and then tells her to go out and faith heal. Well, that's the same thing Jesus is doing, right? You don't have to have any special powers. All you got to do is present the BS. It's all in how you sell it. It's all in how, it's more in how convinced you sound. The sound of conviction, provides confidence, and people want to believe. So if you just make believe that, if you believe hard enough, you can make the mountain fall into the sea. You can tell the mountain to jump into the sea, and the mountain will do that. And it's all about whether you believe it. And there isn't an ounce of it that's true. And the same thing applies not only to Christianity, but to every other religion, and in even the neo-pagan stuff. There's this woman who does a YouTube video series called Ask Teal, Teal, and she's a marvelous neo-pagan because she can talk for 20 minutes very confidently without saying one testable statement ever.
Yes.
And I don't know how she just does that off the cuff, but you can't test anything she says, but she's absolutely confident about all of it. And this is what you get with religion.
That is exactly what you get with religion. I agree. That's the problem. It's infantile, it's projection, but it's all grounded in the appropriation of sacred violence. It creates a God who's all-powerful, who does things from on high, who's a puppeteer. That's the problem. I see Jesus deconstructing that God. So when Jesus, you just quoted, for example, you know how Kenneth Hagin says, you could say to this mountain, be cast into the sea. The charismatic takes a text like that, and they think it refers to any mountain out there. Jesus, when you go back into Second Temple Judaism, Jesus is not talking about actually saying to a physical mountain, you will be cast into the sea. He's referring to the Temple Mount and the problem of sacrifice on the Temple Mount. Jesus' whole project is anti-sacrificial. So many of these sayings and so many of these things that Jesus will do are anti-sacrificial. He's seeking to deconstruct that God.
Then why is he presented as a sacrifice himself?
He's not presented as a sacrifice.
He's not the lamb.
In Western Christendom, for the first 1,000 years, there's no concept of Jesus as a sacrifice. That comes with Anselm of Canterbury in 1098, who writes Cur Deus Homo, and who edits it on the battlefield of the Crusades with Pope Urban. It's later given a fine-tuning by John Calvin after 1539, who wants to say, okay, Jesus is a sacrifice to appease the wrath of God because God's pissed off at us, and so he slaughters his own son to forgive us our sins. That is a crap reading of the New Testament. And it's
So
a
are
crap
you
reading.
suggesting, are you suggesting
I have a
that,
whole different atonement theory.
are you suggesting that these later revisionists went back and rewrote the original Gospels so
No,
that
no, they didn't rewrite it, but what they
okay,
did was they misread it. That is, when you're in a culture, and if again, I'm going to quote Rene Girard here: culture and religion are both born out of the same mechanism, the mechanism of sacred violence, the all against one mechanism of sacrifice. I'm just going to heuristically use that. If you're in a culture that depends upon us and them thinking, we're good, they're bad. Our violence is good, their violence is bad. If that's your cultural thinking, you're going to go back to the texts that authorize you, that if it's the Bible, if it's the Quran, if it's the Torah, whatever it is, you're going to go back to those texts and find what you're looking for. And this is what these thinkers were doing. And what they were not doing was noting the extraordinary ways in which the New Testament writers, in talking about this Jesus event, were radically deconstructing it. So I'll give you one example. So there's a book in the New Testament, the letter to the Hebrews. You're familiar with that book? Okay, so it's all about, the temple, the sacrificial system, this and that and the other. Christians want to go, oh, look.
I can't remember offhand. Yeah, go ahead. I'm just trying to remember it, but go ahead.
Yeah, it's all right. It's basically, the writer's going, okay, look, we have this whole sacrificial apparatus that, is in the Jewish tradition. It's got priests, it's got a tabernacle, it's got an altar, it's the whole system. If you've seen Mel Gibson's Apocalypto, it's kind of that system on a smaller level, but we use animals, and all this stuff. And then Christians make this mistake. They go, oh, look, Jesus is a sacrifice like these sacrifices. Because what they fail to do is they fail to note that writer in particular moves away from thuo and thusia, the verbs for to sacrifice, to pharaoh, prosphero, diaphero, anaphero, yes, which are to offer oneself. They fail to miss that the trajectory of the New Testament is that Jesus isn't sacrificed to appease God.
Right.
We sacrifice him to appease ourselves. They miss this in the Pauline writings. They miss it in the Gospel of John. They miss it in Hebrews. They miss it in Jesus' own ministry. Our tendency is to try and make Jesus into our own image. And this is what I am resisting with every fiber in my being.
So, Michael, would you suggest that the church, in a sense, gave us a failed meta-language of theology, and this is why the people are buying the bullshit?
Absolutely. And we've been doing this since the 2nd century.
Yes.
In fact, it's even in the New Testament itself.
Certainly.
The little letter to Jude is a mythologization of the gospel. The book of the Revelation is a mythologization at points. I would even argue that the Gospel of Matthew itself is really struggling with wanting to move in a non-sacrificial direction, but is still tied, as it were, or chained, as it were, to sacrificial thinking.
Would you agree that the Gospels, for the most part, were penned mostly by the aristocrats? That is, in light of Dr. Bart Ehrman's finds. In other words, he's articulating the possibility of a Q text, possibly an M and an L, but for the most part, the aristocrats are the ones speaking about this, and this is why it's disconcerting in a sense that so many people are trying to articulate, this is exactly what Jesus said. And so in a sense, we're dealing not so much with a real Jesus, we're dealing with this iconic Jesus in a sense. Would you agree with that?
Oh, there's no doubt that when we come to the Gospels, for me, this is for me, Michael, I mean, Dr. Jones, I'm sorry, blew that one. For me, the historical Jesus quest is important, but it is not the be-all and end-all. That is, we have to reckon with the fact that when we are reading the Gospels, we are reading Jesus through the lens of the early Christian communities. That's just, for me, that's a given. And so one of the things we have to do is we have to constantly, in a sense, use a series of checks and balances in gospel scholarship between Jesus, the historical Jesus, as he's constantly being reconstructed in terms of scholarship, and that Jesus is always changing and will depend on the scholar that you're reading. But there are certain patterns that you can see in that scholarship where there's general agreements on certain lines of thinking. So, for example, Jesus was not an apocalyptic preacher. That's kind of a generally agreed way of seeing Jesus. The church tended to be apocalyptic in its thinking, read that back into Jesus, and so created sayings and these kinds of things that are apocalyptic in nature. On the other hand, I think you have to use each of the four canonical Gospels as critics of each other, and then the historical Jesus. So you're dealing with the textual Jesus, the historical Jesus, and then there is, in the paradigm that I use in the Jesus-driven life, is you have the textual Jesus, the historical Jesus, but you also have the Jesus of tradition. And I think at that point, what's always been important to me is to reckon with the fact that if you have Jesus being portrayed as a heavy-handed, top-down, violent type of deity, you're dealing with a God, small g, that's easily deconstructed. If you're dealing with a human being who is not omniscient, is not omnipresent, just as a human being, as a Jewish itinerant preacher who has a vision of life that is nonviolent, non-retributive, caring, peacemaking, reconciliatory, whose sociological, political, economic vision is so different than that of empire thinking, religious empire thinking, political empire thinking. That figure is always going to be a thorn in the flesh. And so I can say, oh, well, I see that figure in St. Francis of Assisi. Oh, I see that figure in certain mystics. Oh, I see that figure in someone like Dr. King. Oh, I see that figure in Gandhi.
Yes.
You know? So that's how I appropriate or have the checks and balances when it comes to Jesus.
The way that you describe Jesus as deconstructing, this previous mythology, I don't get that interpretation. Now, maybe if the Gospel of Thomas were included in the canon, maybe I could see that. Because, only there did I ever see, well, no, there's maybe two or three examples where Jesus said that, if God wanted you to be circumcised, then he wouldn't have put the foreskin there in the first place. That was a word of wisdom that we could have used in the rest of the canon. But apart from two other examples, he seems to fit pretty well with the dogma. He said that that you didn't have to follow the Sabbath, and what was the other one about the stoning of the woman, for whatever reason he let her go, but otherwise it's very provincial. He's isolated only to Israel, and he's fulfilling the laws of Moses, every jot and tittle, so forth. So I don't see him.
He's not. Oh no, Jesus is an anarchist.
So when he says that if you disobey any of these laws, then you will be called least in the kingdom of heaven, how do you interpret that?
Well, first thing I have to do is I have to recognize I'm dealing with a text that's been compiled by an editor, the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus just didn't get up one day and preach this whole thing eloquently. So I have a compiled text. Matthew 5:17 through 20 is a series of 4 very different sayings that have been brought together in the tradition. The question is, how does the author of that, or the editor, the compiler, the redactor of that text, want us to hear, understand, or interpret that text? because immediately following that text where Jesus says, anyone who teaches the little ones to avoid the least of these, that one's screwed, turns around and says, you've heard it said, but I say to you.
Something quite different.
And violates or voids several very, very clear prohibitions in Torah. So is the statement to be taken literally? Can it be taken ironically or sarcastically? Do you see what I'm saying? Does it have to be read literally?
Yeah, for me it does.
Well, for me it doesn't.
If I can insert,
if you're going to call it absolute truth, then yeah, it does.
But let's.
You're reading the Bible the same way the fundamentalist does, and I refuse to do.
Yeah, I'm an atheist. Atheists are the most literal in their interpretation of the Bible, even over the fundamentalists. We read exactly what it says without interpreting it.
Okay, but my point is,
all reading is interpretation. There's no such thing as a literal reading. I mean, you've already got an interpretation from Jesus Aramaic to the Greek of the Gospels, another interpretation from the Greek of the Gospels to the English of the translations you read. And then on top of that, you've got all the interpretations of those texts that have been given to you over 2,000 years. Some of them are embedded within Western Christian culture, and that's all you know. I mean, you're dealing with interpretation on interpretation. There's no such thing as a literal reading. It doesn't exist.
I have a question here, and either one of you can answer it. In chapter 5, he states that I came to fulfill the law. Now, if it's not a case of irony or pushing back, why did he say after that? You've heard it stated, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I'm going to tell you something quite different, and I'm paraphrasing here. He goes on to say, you've heard it stated that love your neighbors and hate your enemies, but I'm going to tell you something quite different. Love your neighbors and your enemies. And so isn't that contesting the law, not fulfilling the law? In other words, isn't Jesus simply saying, hey, let me, I don't mind being the least in the kingdom?
Mm-hmm.
No, I see Jesus being a bit different, taking his own spin like so many people do. I mean, with every religious cult leader that you get, I mean, they're always going to add their own interpretations to it. I mean, one of the most fascinating books that I ever read was Bugliosi's Helter Skelter, because of the theology of Charles Manson and the way that he rationalized everything he read, including the White Album by the Beatles, going lyric for lyric and reading the interpretations through his mind of what he thought all of those songs meant, because he thought that the Beatles were the four locusts with the hair like women, that these people were writing these messages encrypted in their song lyrics specifically to him. And so he's coming up with all these bizarre interpretations that the Beatles are actually trying to communicate with him. So Charles Manson then starts writing songs back, which he intends to publish, so that the Beatles can receive his return transmission.
But if you want to use science, but here's the thing, Aron, if you want to use science, why wouldn't you want to use scientific hermeneutic methods? Why would you say, oh, I'm going to use science to understand biology, I'm going to use science to understand chemistry, I'm going to use science to understand astrophysics, I'm going to use science to understand genetics, but when it comes to the Bible, I'm not going to use science. I'm not going to use scientific methods, I'm not going to use hermeneutics, I'm not going to use the disciplines, the scientific disciplines that scholars use. Why would you say, oh, when it comes to the Bible, I'm just going to go literal?
Why would you say that I wouldn't do that? I mean, when I'm reading... Okay. You understand, and I've given speeches on this, you can look them up. I mean, I understand that when I'm reading Genesis, that it says that there's a snake talking to these people. So I read it as that's a snake talking to these people. Now, at the same time, I understand that the snake actually comes from the serpent who could not be tamed that's in the Hilopu tree with Lilith, and that it was originally Gilgamesh walking through the garden, and that's where the flaming sword came from and all. I understand all of that. But the story, as I'm reading it now, says it's a snake talking to these people. And so I don't try to interpret that it's actually Satan, that old serpent, because how could I interpret that? I know that it was originally the serpent that can't be tamed from the Hilopu tree. Right? So I'm not putting in these interpretations. I am following the scholarship, but I'm still reading the story as it says. When it talks about two trees, I know that everywhere else in the Bible, when it says, thou shalt not eat of the fruit of blank, everywhere else except Genesis, the fruit of or the fruit of the tree of is always a parable of something. But in Genesis, it's literal, because I live in Texas, and this is the way everybody has to read it. So,
you see, that's the problem. No, I'm not going to go there. I am not going to go there. Texas, yeah, okay.
Hey, we have run out of time, unfortunately. It's been wonderful to have both of you on the show this morning. I'm having a guest on tonight. He's a devout Muslim. His name is Abdul Mando. And it's going to be interesting to sit down and have him in the studio. I asked him if he wanted to have a glass of wine. I like having wine while I'm doing a show. But he chose tea, so we are doing tea time tonight. So I'd like to invite our audience to be here as well, and we may have a post-show hangout. And so I just wanted to get that plug in there for that show. But I wanted to end this show in particular on this note. I want to ask both of you guys to find something good to say about the other person, because the conversation should never get into us versus them. And you guys have maintained a high level of respect in this show, and I so appreciate both of you guys. You guys are awesome people. We want you in Pensacola. We want to film you simply because it takes people like you to move people forward, and we're so thankful for what both of you guys are contributing, namely to the conversation in so many people's lives. And so I'm going to give it to Michael first. What are your statements about AronRa? I mean,
I'm very excited. I'm very excited about your work. I'm very excited about how important it is for you to deconstruct this Janus-faced Western God. I applaud that. I am very excited about your work. I also love your hair. You know. No, but I truly affirm where you're at and the life journey you're on, and I also want to say that I'm really sorry that you're surrounded by people who will not think. I'm sorry, and I applaud your thinking. I applaud your rational, logical mind. For me, that you remember that movie, A Beautiful Mind? Well, you've got one.
Oh, well, thank you very much. And if I may respond in kind, I respect your scholarship, and I'm also happy with the fact that you're trying to help me out of my situation by reaching the mainstream people who will never listen to a word that I say. So thank you for that.
Indeed.
I'd like to thank both of you guys for being on the show. It's been fun. Let's do this again soon. So this has been The Place. We shall see you this evening. It's going to be a wonderful show.
Thanks.
Good night, all.
Good night.